I'm Leo Mazo, Louise B. and J. Harwood Cochran, Curator of American Art here at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. I really, it's so great to see we have such a great crowd here tonight. Thank you all for coming out. We're obviously here to see this wonderful presentation by Dr. Susie Rawles. So many sponsors, lenders, so many supporters to thank. The one I would just like to give just a special shout out to, a note, an acknowledgement of deep gratitude is to Jane Joel Knox, who is the major supporter of this exhibition, its venue here. And Jane, thank you so very much. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the evening's lecture by Dr. Rawles. Susie Rawles is the Elizabeth Locke Associate Curator of American Decorative Arts here at VMFA. She received her PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary, her MA in Art History from Rice University, and her undergraduate degree in Economics and Government from Smith College. Dr. Rawles has been a critical part of the curatorial team at VMFA since 1995. She played key roles in several projects to date, notably in the major American art installation projects of 2010 and 2015, while contributing important essays to the publications accompanying each of these projects. In 2018, she organized the exhibition Collecting for the Commonwealth, celebrating a century of art patronage at VMFA, 1919 to 2018 at the Winter Antique Show in New York, and for which she wrote the accompanying scholarly catalog. Her exhibition, A Return to the Grand Tour, Micro-Mosaic Jewels from the collection of Elizabeth Locke, which I bet many of you saw, for which she also wrote the catalog, opened at VMFA in 2019, and then traveled in 2020 to early 21 to the Gibbs Museum of Art in Charleston. Susie has a way of insisting on both exquisite artistry and the critical but always clear scholarships that brings that artistic realm to rich life. And at any given time, she seems to have several scholarly projects going on, including really her ongoing research into the art of John Singleton Copley, which most recently resulted in a wonderful article in July 2021 in the esteemed journal Burlington Magazine. And she has brought this dual emphasis in stunning aesthetics and art and cultural history to the VMFA showing of the exhibition Whistler to Cassatt, American Painters in France. Although wonderfully organized by our friends and colleagues at the Denver Art Museum, Susie has breathed all kinds of new life into this project, and I think has made a serious, and I think you'll agree with me, a real contribution to the scholarship. She worked closely with the VMFA designer Tamar Peterson in bringing this exhibition to new and brilliant life, and in a way that makes the most of our stunning lower level gallery. She also wrote the wall labels, and she wrote one of the catalog essays. Her topic tonight is Belle, Époque, American Women Artists in France, 1871-1914. Please do join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Rawles.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Leo. That was very sweet. We are thrilled to bring you this exhibition, which I think will appeal to people on any number of levels, and I hope you'll be able to spend a lot of time strolling through the galleries. I want to start by taking you back a century ago when much of the Western world was at war. Though the American Civil War ended in 1865, it was the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 that opened the floodgates and permitted artists from around the world to take advantage of new opportunities for travel and study abroad. As the troops disappeared and new boundaries were drawn, an international coterie of talents descended upon Paris, drawn by the promise of its academy and its masters and its hope of a Belle Époque. Among those who flocked to Paris during the course of this peaceful era, between the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 and the beginning of World War I in 1914, were 5 American women artists. They arrived at different moments, after the Civil War, after the Prussian War, and well into the 1880s. And they remained for different periods, for a lifetime, for a decade, or for just a few years at most. Regardless, each sheds light on the implication of the artistic experience for American women of the era, the impact of French-born artistic influences, and the circumstances of current social and cultural climates. In fact, American women artists approaching what Century Magazine called at the time this transitional age in art faced a spectrum of opportunities and challenges at home and abroad. The evolution of the American Museum had begun when Charles Willson Peale opened his Philadelphia Columbianum, the founding of the New York Academy of Fine Art, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. Founded in 1805, the Pennsylvania Academy was based on a European academic model, but diverged significantly from that formula in exhibiting and purchasing work by women artists. In 1844, women were enrolled as students, were employed as faculty, and by the late 1860s were ultimately admitted into the life drawing class, once restricted to their male colleagues. In this, however, they stood second to New York's more recent National Academy of Design. Already, the National Academy of Design had instituted life drawing classes for women in 1857. Founded by artists, for artists, the School of the Academy opened in 1826. In 1837, it added life classes to its curriculum for advanced male students, and 2 decades later permitted women to attend. As with traditional European academies, students at both institutions learned by drawing from plaster casts, as well as from leading artists from a range of topics: anatomy, perspective, ancient history, architecture, and mythology. By the end of the 19th century, the National Academy of Design had adopted the European studio system, which gave students the option of working under a specific master. These were progressive trends, but they did not dwarf the historic appeal of Europe. France continued to be celebrated as the center of Western culture, attracting the eminent artists now recorded in the annals of art history. That luster was a magnet for female art students who, despite the opportunities at home, journeyed to Paris during the Belle Époque to train for future careers or to nurture an amateur talent. Unlike their male colleagues, however, women could not compete for entrance into the École des Beaux-Arts. As the conservative French Academy deemed it unsuitable for women to study from the male nude, they were denied access to the classical curriculum until 1897. In the interim, American women artists piloted their own way, taking advantage of alternative opportunities in this transformative artistic era. As has been repeatedly argued since Linda Nochlund's seminal 1971 essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?", the place of women in the canon of art history has been compromised by their limited access to classical training. As the academic hierarchy for art privileged the figure above all else, drawing from life became the essential prerequisite for artistic importance. Highly esteemed, multi-figured history paintings were thus deemed, at least officially, the unique talent of great male artists. By extension, copyist work and inferior-ranking arts, genres like miniature and still life painting, or decorative arts like china painting, were considered women's work because they precluded the need for figural studies. Not only did this impede the recognition of women artists, but having accepted the authority of the academic hierarchy, the consequent mediocrity of women's production was commonly spun as evidence of their inferior mental and physical capacities, a circular argument that made credible their rightful place in the private domestic sphere. Aspiring women painters navigated this gender bias in one of three ways: through entrance into drawing programs for graphic arts, the hiring of private instructors, or enrollment in private studios. Prior to the introduction of these académies payantes, very few women were accepted into artist studios. Consequently, as Rudolf Julian observed, quote, "Women who have become famous in French art have benefited by being their father's pupils." In the United States, these social and institutional restrictions were born of an increasingly polarized view of public male masculine and private female feminine emerging alongside the mechanization of the workplace and the specialization of human labor in the post-Civil War period. As the Working Men Advocate recorded in 1870, quote, "Man is and should be head of his own department in the management of his business for the support of his family. Women should be head in her own department in the management of household affairs and the care and government of the children." To that end, in addition to domestic management skills, women were tutored in the needs of a, quote, "maternal commonwealth," an extension of the 18th century's Republican motherhood that tasked women with cultivating virtue in the domestic sphere. In its revised form, American women of the era were charged with protecting society from violence, intemperance, profligacy, and other corrupting influences of modern life. These demands also resulted in the establishment of women's colleges. According to Sophia Smith, founder of Smith College, the purpose of this higher education was, quote, "not to render my sex less feminine, but to develop the powers of womanhood." Though the maternal commonwealth encouraged intervention in public life only insofar as was necessary, the mere granting of a civic role and voice set the stage for a new woman waiting in the wings. In the meantime, however, middle and upper middle class women who traversed the threshold into unsuitable or unchaperoned spaces subjected themselves to allegations of androgyny for presuming to trespass on masculine territory, or carnality for exposing themselves to public view. That vulnerability is resonant in Emily Mary Osborne's Nameless and Friendless. In addition to the consuming gaze of the male onlookers, Osborne's subject is compromised by the commercial nature of her exchange, which invoked parallels to prostitution. These conditions crossed national and temporal boundaries. In his memoir of Paris during the 1880s, the British artist John Shirley Fox recounted one Paris scene in which a female exhibitor, quote, "had to put up with many jests and rather risky compliments before reaching the security of the salon building." Yet women persisted. Upon arriving in France in 1864, the American artist Elizabeth Jane Gardner found that Paris, quote, "had not a studio nor a master who would receive me." Recalling that famous women artists had inevitably been the wives, sisters, or daughters of male painters, she took a cue from Rosa Bonheur and donned boys' clothing to pass unnoticed in the streets. This subterfuge, as she recalled, enabled me to study after the nude at the Gobelin factory. Late in the following year, Mary Cassatt arrived in Paris. In lieu of enrolling at the École, she was honored to become a paying student in the studio of leading academician Jean-Léon Gérôme, at twice the expense of her male colleagues. Gérôme's reputation as a severe critic was well known. According to one American student, he was considered merciless in judgment, yet possessed a singular magnetism and made considerable efforts on behalf of his students. Even so, his atelier was considered by some the most riotous and lewd of all the studios at Beaux-Arts. The social and economic costs of a professional painting career likely discouraged many women artists, but perseverance could have its rewards. In 1868, Gardner, Cassatt, and Eliza Haldeman became the first American women to be admitted to the Salon. Though pleased to be honored, Cassatt and Haldeman privately ridiculed the jury's leniency in awarding 40 medals and admitting 1,200 more pictures than usual. Significantly, they interpreted the jury's liberal requirements as a reactionary effort to restore the école's place at the center of artistic activity. A growing interest in modernist movements had compromised the authority of the official academy and had the private ateliers. Rudolf Julian opened his academy that same year, extending admission to women in 1873. Though initially co-ed, public uproar led to the segregation by gender, and one of his several studios became devoted to women. In this way, drawing on the talents of respected masters, the Academy Julian became ostensibly, quote, the first to make it possible for the ordinary woman student to study art in Paris. In addition to general instruction, Julian's ateliers employed internal competitions to prepare students for public exhibition and patronage. Conducted under gender-blind conditions, these monthly trials were astonishing to Julian for how often women have the best of it, particularly with regard to portraiture, which has generally been considered a man's specialty. When the Academy Julian has received much attention, other masters also took advantage of the profitable opportunities occasioned by the growing demand for private art education. What distinguished these private studios from the government-run école was not the curriculum. Both operated on a traditional studio system, but the greater degree of liberty afforded. Though classical study was still proselytized, freedom to experiment invited the influence of more avant-garde artists into the atelier, while summer seasons in Giverny, Pont-Aven, Fontainebleau, and elsewhere exposed students to alternative palettes, techniques, and subject matter. Combined, the studios and summer sessions offset the sacrifice of formal academic study. The resulting incursion of non-academic ideas into academic practices imparted greater individuality and innovation among the studios. The more progressive taste defied the conservative expectations of the Academy and its salon, resulting in the establishment of alternative salons, both public and private, as well as a greater diversity of tastes among dealers and patrons. The most famous sponsored salons was the Salon des Refusés, organized by the famous painter Gustave Courbet and held at the Palace of Industry in 1863. The event was sanctioned by Emperor Napoleon III to compensate for the outcry when almost half of the approximately 5,000 salon submissions were rejected. Among the artists who exhibited were Edouard Manet, the country's leading contemporary artist, and James McNeill Whistler, whose Symphony in White No. 1, The White Girl, had been refused at both the Royal Academy of 1862 and the 1863 Paris Salon. But, as this cartoon suggests, far more petite salons also came into being. By 1881, these alternative venues were becoming increasingly important for women artists who experienced growing resistance at the Salon. To understand why, we need to go back a year to the 1880 Salon. That year, the Salon was a disaster. Infighting between the jury and the Salon's academic director caused the presidents of the painting jury to resign, resulting in the acceptance of an unprecedented number of works, over 7,000 by nearly 3,000 artists. In retaliation, the Salon's director hung the worst paintings in the best spots, humiliating the jury, angering the artists, and causing the public to boycott. The debacle caused the Academy to withdraw its authority and patronage of the Salon, handing over the event to a newly established Society of French Artists, whose independent authority resulted in the election of a new jury of male artists. The independence of the Salon from the state accelerated the pace of modernism and its battle against academic conservatism, but it bore negative consequences for women artists whose works were rejected in record numbers. The volume of rejections reflected not only the disdain that male artists often held for their female colleagues, but the mounting fear of competition arising from the expanding number of marketable works. In response to these conditions, alternative forums were founded, including the Union of Women Painters and Sculptors, established in 1881, which hosted its first exhibition of works by women artists in 1882. The Women's Salon was intended to be a non-traditional and non-hierarchical exhibition that included the decorative arts. It also promoted both new and established artists and provided them with equal access to the desirable hanging spaces. However, while providing women an additional opportunity, the exhibition exposed an underlying tension within the female art community. Unmarried professional artists such as Cassatt may have resisted exhibiting in all-women shows to avoid association with belittled women's art. This qualification warrants scrutiny. Women pursued artistic training to achieve a desirable source of necessary income or as an opportunity for a creative engagement, or both. Yet Marie Bashkirtseff's disparaging proclamation highlights the distinction's divisive tenor. Just imagine, she writes, of the 15 women at the Académie Julian, there is not one who would not laugh or cross herself at the idea of women's emancipation. Some out of ignorance, others because it is not done. Her comment signals an acrimony that likely impeded the progress of women artists. Cassatt makes the point in a letter to her sister-in-law. Recounting a painting excursion in August 1869 with Miss Gordon of Philadelphia, she describes one resort as entirely too gay for two poor painters, before correcting herself, at least for one. For although my friend calls herself a painter, she is only an amateur, and you know how we professionals despise amateurs. Such letters chart the life of many female art students in France. Born in New Hampshire, Gardner arrived in Paris having already studied and taught art in Massachusetts. Once arrived in Paris, she earned an income copying works before attempting to apply for a seat at the Academy, ultimately joining an independent studio of women artists. Her correspondence describes early breakfasts, mornings spent copying works at the Luxembourg, and afternoons drawing a hired model in their shared studio space. Together, these narratives document resilience, determination, and occasional successes. Gardner surmounted a major obstacle when, 4 years after her inaugural 1868 Salon, she became the first American women artist to receive a medal. In part, that recognition can be attributed to her preferred academic style. Resisting artistic individuality, she united academic subjects with warm tones, loose brush, and atmospheric treatment of the Barbizon-style naturalism. Her painting, The Shepherd David, of circa 1895, is a seminal example of her work and illustrates an indebtedness to her mentor, William Bouguereau. Similar successes were achieved by her younger contemporary, Elizabeth Nourse, whose paintings also featured rural subjects. Born near Cincinnati, Ohio, Nourse studied at the McMicken School of Design and the Art Students League in New York before working as a professional in her native city. In 1887, she settled in Paris with her sister Louise, who became her lifelong companion and business manager. Having already established her mature style, Nourse studied only briefly at the Académie Julian before setting up her own studio. Thereafter, the two sisters traveled extensively, capturing on canvas the various rural subjects that would become the corpus of her work. In fact, Norse's subject matter and technique won her the moniker Little Millet from the son of Barbizon master Jean-François Millet, and her debt to Millet is imparted by a mother, which received critical attention in Paris, London, and New York. However, while her rural subjects compare closely with those of Gardner, Norse's unsentimental observation of common folk arrived at more progressive ends. The difference between Gardner and Norse was noted by James Gordon Bennett in 1892 as one of old versus new art, whereas Gardner's more conservative, romanticized, idealized approach to her subject matter, he wrote, is old school. Norse's work, quote, skirts the edges of the conventional and sentimental without falling in. Hogarth's Battle of the Pictures of 1743 reminds us that art has constantly been in motion, and the works of Norse and Gardner highlight the different artistic practices being employed during this transitional age, and the coinciding range of techniques adopted by women painters, from academic classicism to naturalism, and ultimately to realism. The Barbizon School, as it was later termed, was a collection of artists who were united in their shared appreciation for landscape as subject matter. That appreciation for nature's own merits took them into the landscape where they adopted a so-called naturalist technique. That technique was idealized by academic artists in rendering their classical figural subjects, as in the example of Gardner and Bouguereau. Realism, on the other hand, while it shared an emphasis on the truthful rendering of contemporary human experience, invested it with additional social and political overtones. Turning from everyday landscapes to everyday people, and eschewing classicism's idealized ancient and allegorical themes, realism elevated once marginalized human subjects to the stature of heroic figures. Unlike naturalism, realism held man, rather than nature, accountable for the human condition. Born in the wake of the 1848 revolutions, realism pulsed with the beat of a democratic crusade seeking to transform conditions among the laboring classes. It was in that spirit that Norse sought to capture her subjects. Recalling the era's radical literature, Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto of 1848, for example, works by Norse and others stripped away the rosy romantic lens of former years to reveal the truth of human hardship. In recognition of her talents, Norse was named the first American woman, and second woman in general, elected to membership in the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts. The new National Society for the Arts provided a more open forum for exhibition among artists of all nationalities. Founded in 1890, it marked the end of the dominant authority. Indeed, it was likely this pressure on the Academy's authority that prompted the admission of women into the École. However, it is noteworthy that, like many of the members of the Union of Women Painters and Sculptors, those who took advantage of the École's new policy were known for preserving a tradition in the arts, a position in marked contrast to their more progressive colleagues. Perhaps as a result of these trends, Norse's subject matter and technique also evolved. In 1910, the French government purchased her painting, The Closed Shutters, for the Luxembourg Museum, making Norse the first contemporary woman artist to be so honored. The everyday interior scene was a departure from her rural figures, and its alternative lens of color, light, and atmosphere registered her transition towards Impressionism. The non-academic style was inspired by the paintings of Claude Monet, who encouraged artists to paint what you really see, enveloped in sunlight and atmosphere. Monet's mantra and its results found an additional advocate in the Boston-born Lilla Cabot-Perry, who, like the French masters, sought to achieve truth in her work. Having taken up the brush with Ernest the years before her marriage, Perry studied with various Boston masters before crossing the Atlantic in 1887 to enter the Academy's Colarossi and Julian. Her success in these studios won her a place with Alfred Stevens, who inspired her talent for interior portraits. 2 years after her arrival, she met Monet in Giverny and began a friendship that was annually renewed with regular visits over the next 10 years. Perry's indebtedness to Monet is evident in her facility with plein air or outdoor techniques, and her fidelity to nature is illustrated in the painting Giverny Landscape in Monet's Garden of 1897. But Perry also applied Monet's formula to interior scenes. Lady with a Bowl of Violets of 1910 exemplifies her approach to a genre particularly favored by American audiences. Perry did not meet Monet until 1889, 3 years after the last Impressionist exhibition, so she never exhibited with the Impressionists. Of all the American artists in France, only Mary Cassatt was invited to show with the group. Born in Pittsburgh and reared in Philadelphia, Cassatt studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts before, fed up with its methods, she went to Paris at the end of 1865, where she remained until the onset of the Franco-Prussian War. On the insistence of her father, she returned to Philadelphia to wait out the turmoil before traveling through Europe and settling permanently in France in 1874. Despite this movement, Cassatt continued to exhibit at the annual salons. However, following her more conventional display at the 1868 salon, she was increasingly drawn to new subjects and techniques. That break from convention was prompted, at least in part, by a disappointing rejection from the 1873 salon. Amending her artistic trajectory, she submitted Ida the following year. It was Ida that won her the attention of Edgar Degas, who 3 years later invited her to exhibit with the Impressionists. By 1877, Cassatt's facility with the avant-garde vernacular had made her the equal of her French contemporaries, and her subject matter and technique had started to evolve. In that year, when both of her submissions to the salon were rejected, she accepted Degas' invitation to exhibit with the so-called independents and began preparations for the next event. The Reader of 1877 imparts an interest in domestic interior scenes, a subject popular with American audiences. At the same time, works such as Children in the Garden, A Woman and a Girl Driving, and Lydia seated on a porch crocheting signal her adoption of traditional Impressionist subjects, which privileged outdoor compositions and depictions of bourgeois leisure. Cassatt exhibited with the Impressionists in 1879, but her decision to do so was not without risks. The first exhibition of the so-called Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Printmakers was held in Nader's studio in 1874, where Monet's painting Impression Sunrise lent the group its subsequent name. In fact, however, the term Impressionist had already been used to describe the sketchy approach to landscape painting adopted by others. And despite the intended satire, there was a general appreciation for the artistic break from convention, particularly as it applied to landscape. One French critic remarked, quote, "There is talent, a lot of talent. These young painters understand nature in a way that is neither boring nor worn out. Instead, it is lively, succinct, dashing, simply bewitching." That same critic went on to explain, "Were one to characterize their goals with one word, one would have to create the new term Impressionists. They are Impressionists in the sense that they do not represent a landscape, but the sensation it evokes. They even use the term themselves. It is not the landscape, it is the impression, as the catalog calls the sunrise by Mr. Monet." The term became their self-styled description, beginning with the third Impressionist exhibition of 1877, the year that Cassatt was invited to join the group. The Impressionists held 8 exhibitions between 1874 and 1886. Cassatt's first submission in 1879 included Little Girl in a Blue Armchair. critical reception of her work varied considerably. On one hand, her decision to depart from the academic canon led one New York Times critic to lament that she had thus gone astray. On the other hand, one London critic recognized Impressionism as occupying some of the cleverest artists in France. Going on to praise Cassatt's figure works, he described how, quote, the restless flutter, the feverish activity, the momentarily changing passions and habits of the time are recorded with a lightness, a certainty, and sufficiency of which a more weighty hand or more patient eye must despair. These characteristics resonate in works such as Young Girl at the Window. Despite the generally positive reception of European audiences, early sales of Impressionist paintings in the United States were erratic at best. Yet Cassatt was instrumental in promoting its patronage by her contemporaries. The most notable patron was Louisine Elder, who had arrived in Paris with her family in 1873 and was introduced to Cassatt through their mutual friend, the artist Emily Sartain. Soon thereafter, Cassatt successfully encouraged her acquisition of a work by Degas, and following her marriage to Henry Havemeyer, became instrumental in shaping the couple's extraordinary collection of Impressionist works. It was on Cassatt's advice, too, that the great Chicago collectors, Bertha and Potter Palmer, developed their collection of Impressionist works. Introduced in 1889, Cassatt likewise initiated the Palmers' introduction with the purchase of Degas on the stage. At the same time as Cassatt was encouraging patronage of works by Degas, Perry was promoting the works of Monet to several friends and relatives in America. To her great astonishment, she wrote, hardly anyone liked it. That resistance to the avant-garde style would change in the following decade. A broader appreciation for Impressionism took seed following the exhibition by Durand Ruhl in New York and Chicago, and the return of American artists and their lessons from France. In 1886, on the invitation of James Sutton of the American Art Association in New York, Paul Durand Ruhl sent 300 contemporary canvases to America with the help of Cassatt, solidifying the introduction of Impressionism in America. Their success was particularly marked in Chicago. Still remaking itself into a modern city after the devastating fire of 1871, Chicago embraced the father of Impressionism when 2 years after the New York show, Monet's works were first exhibited at Thurber's Gallery in 1888. A second exhibition of works was held in October of the same year, prompting one Chicago Tribune critic to remark, "Why go to Paris since Paris has come to Chicago?" 3 years later, the Palmers acquired 20 of the artist's paintings, the first of 90 that shaped their collection. In 1895, the Institute of Chicago became the first American museum to host a solo show of Monet's work, and in 1903, the first to acquire his paintings. It now boasts the largest collection outside of Paris. Years it framed, the 8 Impressionist exhibitions were marked by Cassatt's own personal and professional development. The 5th Impressionist exhibition, held in 1880, featured Cassatt's painting, Tea. Yet none of the names of the show's women artists were featured in the advertisements. Only the 16 men were listed. Even so, Cassatt persisted. Though Cassatt did not exhibit in 1882 on account of her sister Lydia's death, she returned for the final show in 1886, exhibiting Children in a Garden. Then, at the close of the final Impressionist show, Cassatt paused from the exhibition circuit and began to explore alternative sources of inspiration. Having studied printmaking while in Rome in the early 1870s, Cassatt returned to printmaking in 1878 when she, Degas, and others were exploring the possibility of starting a new print journal. Though the journal never materialized, it sparked her renewed interest in the medium. Cassatt's innovations are suggested by the letter of 1890 to 91, which is indebted to the influence of Japanese art and technique. Following Paris's 1890 exhibition of Japanese color woodcuts, Cassatt began mixing printing and painting techniques in the quest to produce colored prints. During the mid-1880s, she was practicing dry point, an intaglio technique in which a hard needle is worked into a copper plate. With the exhibition of 1890, she also turned to an earlier aquatint or brushing technique that imitated watercolor. Using one copper plate for the tonal area and another for dry point etching, she combined the two approaches, applying color to each plate before impressing them on paper and repeating the process for each work while making modifications to ensure their uniqueness. Her success was celebrated in a series of 10 dry point and aquatint works exhibited at Dernruhl's Gallery in 1891, among which was included the letter. In addition to her technical innovations, the compositional perspectives, the angling, and flattening of the design, and the domestic themes all speak to Cassatt's fascination with Japanisme. The same themes also resonated in her now famous modern Madonna subjects. By the late 1880s, Cassatt had embarked on her familiar mother and child imagery. Yet even work such as Baby in a Dark Suit, looking over his mother's shoulder, of about 1889, received mixed reviews. Writing in 1894, one author denounced her excessive attention to everyday subjects as perversion, calling her out for the homeliness of her sitters as, quote, out-Heroding Herod for pure ugliness' sake. Moreover, domestic scenes complicated her effort to avoid gendered judgments. Her success with mother and child imagery was commonly attributed to her biological tendencies ascribed to women in general, undermining the objective and intellectual truths she sought to portray. Despite the challenges faced by Cassatt and other female artists, a growing number of women were pursuing professional training. In May of 1880, the artist reported 2,150 women artists in the Paris ateliers. However, these statistics merit some qualification. Of the women who exhibited at the 1877 Paris Salon, 73% worked in the, quote, lesser media of porcelain, ivory, paper, and the like. Only 27% submitted paintings. The opposite was true among men. While this might reflect any number of causes, the preference of the women themselves, the quality of the submitted works, or the contemporary biases of male jurors to accept or unresponsive to paintings by contemporary women, it does suggest the continuity of historical prejudices. As documented, the French Royal Academy, though founded in 1648, admitted its first women member in 1663. In 1783, the number was limited to 4. And following a period of greater inclusion between 1791 and 1795, the Institute of France and its successor, the Académie des Beaux-Arts, closed ranks against women, retracting any formerly awarded titles of academician and refusing any future such titles until the 20th century. During the same period, the Academy put forward a hierarchical distinction between artists, intellectuals, and artisans, mechanics, that favored an association between high art production and men. These statistics confirm the measurable impact of institutional barriers on the success of women artists, supporting Nauckland's conclusion that it was indeed institutionally made impossible for women to achieve artistic excellence on the same footing as men. The histories of Gardner, Norse, Perry, and Cassatt illustrate the various experiences of American women artists in France. Cecilia Beau rounds out that narrative by charting its implications for women in the contemporaneous United States. Born in Philadelphia and reared by her maternal grandmother and aunts, she studied with Catherine Ann Drinker and then worked as a drawing teacher before taking a position as a scientific illustrator. Enrolling at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in 1876, she focused her efforts on portraiture and costume. She also began training in the art of porcelain painting. This, she later considered, the lowest depth I have ever reached in commercial art. In 1880, Belle entered the private studio of William Sartain and began drawing from life. 50 years later, she recalled her teacher's important influence on her work. It was, quote, a very sharp corner I had turned into a new world which was to be continuously mine. What I most remember was the revelation his vision gave me of the model. He always insisted upon the proportions of the head, its power content, the summing up, as it were, of the measure of the individual. Peers, Belle traveled to France more by circumstance than by initiative. In 1883, Belle conceived the idea of an interior landscape portrait featuring her sister Etta embracing her nephew Harry, capturing a seminal moment in the chronology of life when the child's foot would touch down and leave childhood behind. The Last Days of Childhood was exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy's annual exhibition in 1885 and was awarded the Mary Smith Prize for the best work by a woman resident of Philadelphia. It was this success that launched Belle's professional career and prompted her to submit the painting to the Salon. The Last Days of Childhood was hung at the Salon of 1887, and Belle arrived in Paris in 1888 to experience the city and study briefly at the Academy's Julian and Colarossi. Yet already, as the portrait belies, Belle had felt the impact of international art movements. The non-figural components, primarily family heirlooms, are thoughtfully arranged to aesthetic effect. Indeed, the composition, technique, palette, and theme all recall James McNeill Whistler's famed arrangement in gray and black No. 1 of 1871, which was purchased by the French government in 1891. Commonly known as Whistler's Mother, the painting had crossed the Atlantic to Philadelphia in 1881 to take pride of place at the Academy's exhibition, American Artists at Home and in Europe. Though she was later to deny its influence, the painting resonated with Belle on multiple levels. Belle's own life was marked by a mother's premature death and a father's departure. The impact of that loss is felt in the echo of detachment imparted by both artists' work, the succinct delineation of the figures and their juxtaposition with space contribute to the psychological interest and the sense of modernity. Though Belle remained in France for only a short time, her portraits of Maud Darwin and Alexander Harrison indicate her engagement with avant-garde influences emanating from artists such as Manet and the Impressionists. This exposure informed her work, but it did not categorize it. Belle's prowess with portraiture was marked by a singular form of grand manner realism rooted in the golden age of Frans Hals and Diego Velázquez. In a 1910 interview, painter-critic James Britton compared Belle's neo-Baroque technique with that of her compatriot John Singer Sargent, observing that Belle's distinctive use of the stroke was uniquely tempered by her awareness of when to slow its marching, when to take care in the rendering of flesh, accessories, and other details. This combination of fluidity and structure, he argued, resisted any tendency towards heaviness and density, while imparting vigor and originality to her subjects, a dexterity evident in her portrait of Flora Payne Whitney of 1916. Belle returned to the United States, having fine-tuned both her ideas and her technique, and in 1895, she became the first woman instructor of painting and drawing at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. When asked in 1910 about a contemporary woman's chance of achieving artistic success, she responded, "Nothing stands in her way." That sense of progress is supported by numbers. In 1890, the United States Census recorded approximately 11,000 women artists and art professionals, nearly equal to the statistics for men. Moreover, women comprised 1/3 of the active painters during the period. This growth underscores Tamar Garb's claim to the greater complexity of the era's art scene than previously acknowledged. According to Garb, even revisionist art history falls short by ignoring the role of women as both subjects and agents. Those agents included the two generations of women who withstood the prejudices of the French Academy, who denied the opportunity to sketch the male figure in the nude, donned men's clothing, learned avant-garde techniques, and forged an independent path through alternative resources. Other developments also contributed. The French state's disengagement from the salon and the formation of Independent Society of French Artists were evidence of changing times. Female graduates of art schools and studios, like the graduates of women's colleges, were re-entering the domestic realm as well as expanding it, joining together in intellectual, civic, philanthropic, and even professional associations that gained them a foothold in the public sphere. Yet quantitative analysis can be deceiving. On the one hand, in the late 19th century, the École des Beaux-Arts and its salon were no longer the leading arbiters of art production. On the other hand, if a turn away from the École and its systematic repression of female artists was in some way a rejection of the masculine dictates of art production, a rearguard definition of art was also in play. Kirsten Swinth has argued that as women moved into the art professions, men redefined the meaning of art as a uniquely male form of self-expression, heralding a modern, quote, heroic but masculine enterprise of liberation in which male artists elevated style over subject and denied women the biological equipment to be true stylists. The transitional age in art was thus wedded to a transitional age in society in which both men and women grappled with confusing inconsistencies of social identity and their implications for the artistic sphere. The challenges and opportunities faced by women artists belong to a much broader dialectic between disparaging Darwinian claims about a woman's smaller brain and the danger mental exercise posed to her far more important reproductive health, and the pressure to free women, at least in part, from the limitations of a sequestered domestic existence. Gardner, for one, was reluctant to accept the loss of independence. Writing to her sister in 1879 on the occasion of her engagement to Bouguereau, she shared, quote, "I have long been accustomed to my freedom and am beginning to attain a part of the success for which I have struggled so long. I wish to paint by myself a while longer." As it happened, so unacceptable was her status as a woman artist that Bouguereau's mother denied the match. How could a French woman of the old regime accept for her daughter-in-law an American artist who had braved the criticism of all Paris, wrote one journalist? It was simply impossible. 17 years later, when, quote, the old lady died at the age of 91, Gardner traded painting for domestic responsibilities. Though she resumed working after Bouguereau's death in 1905, interim reassurances to her sister hint at the married woman's guilt for more than household duties, a sacrifice avoided by her single colleagues, Belle, Cassatt, and Norse. Belle, Cassatt, and Norse never married, nor did they have life partners. Yet despite Gardner's laments, not all women artists supported the emancipation that Marie Bashkirtseff advocated. Despite declining several marriage proposals to preserve her freedom, Belle, for one, proclaimed herself not to be a feminist. In part, her experience in France may have informed her perspective on the relatively positive conditions for women artists in America. France was among the last countries to open its academy to women. Moreover, in a paradoxical twist, the École's restrictions may have exposed women artists, Belle among them, to the avant-garde trends taking place outside the École sooner than if they had been closeted behind its doors. Nonetheless, Belle did acknowledge the additional pressure a career unfairly placed on women and the resulting need for their superhuman endurance. Whereas men were free to make their own decisions, she noted, women who failed to meet society's expectations met with swift retribution. Consequently, a woman artist must be two selves: the self-determined creator she wants to be and the obligatory persona custom has laid upon her. The dichotomies experienced by women artists, their successes and their challenges, support Nauckland's claim that institutions have been obstacles in their achievement of artistic greatness. But this does not preclude the equally relevant implications of Rodolphe Julien's report or the evidence of tensions within the female art community. Implicit in Julien's statement that successful women artists have been their father's pupils is the underlying scarcity of female mentors during the period. Whereas half of French public schools were directed by women devoted to training women in the graphic or other arts, the absence of women empowering women from the studio, the journals, and the gallery meant that women were not active agents in shaping the values and conditions of artistic success. On the contrary, concerns that their contributions might be disparaged as women's work and the consequent compulsion among women artists to resist association likely compromised their collective achievements. Those who navigated the system and are recorded in the annals of art history, those who set out, as Baxter-Zeff suggested, to become someone at any cost, not only made sacrifices that their male colleagues were not required to make, but each charted her course alone. Thus, while acknowledging the steep curve of institutional constraints, the passive and sometimes hostile stance among women artists should also be recognized as effectively reinforcing the relative authority of the patriarchal model by subverting to it any power that solidarity among women may have realized. The quest for freedom as a form of artistic expression and as a liberty to create was accomplished by very few women artists of the Belle Époque. Indeed, it was the rare recognition given artists such as Belle, Cassatt, Gardner, Norse, and Perry that sparked the question from Richard Feigen, who's a dealer, that provoked Nauckland's query, why have there been no great women artists? Though her conclusion charged women with creating institutions in which true greatness was open to anyone, she might also have tasked them with forging an alliance. It is this truth that makes the women's building of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition so compelling. The outcome of unified demands among leading female educators, philanthropists, and change agents wanting an official role and place at Chicago's World's Fair, the Women's Building was orchestrated by a board of lady managers presided over by the city's leading collector of Impressionism, Bertha Palmer. And despite the patronizing segregation of women into a building compromisingly celebrated as being, quote, like a man's ideal of a woman, delicate, dignified, pure, and fair to look upon, Cassatt's tympanum for modern women was praised as justification enough. In strikingly contemporary tones, her chosen theme, women plucking fruit from the tree of knowledge, acknowledged an impediment to women's success proposed at the start of this talk, the absence of female mentors. At the same time, Cassatt herself stood as evidence of the remarkable progress an independently minded woman artist could make, not only for herself, but for others. The theme resonates in her painting, Child Picking Fruit, of 1893. In depicting the transfer of knowledge from one generation of women to the next, her mural served metaphorically as a visual corrective to mothers' pupils. Thank you.